Imagine being born into a palace. Not a farmhouse, not a village hut, but a grand hall of marble floors, golden chandeliers, and servants bowing as soon as you open your eyes. This was the life of a nobleman's son in 17th century France. Sounds like a dream, but was it really? Asterisk. From the very first breath, his life was planned. He was not raised for freedom. He was raised for duty. If he belonged to a great house, his birth was celebrated with feasts and blessings. But at the same time, expectations weighed heavy on his tiny shoulders. Unlike peasant children, who learned to walk barefoot in fields, a noble boy grew up in a world of rules. He was dressed in miniature versions of adult clothing. Silk shirts, lace collars, tiny boots. Even as a child, he was a symbol of family honor. Education began early. At 5 or 6, a noble boy was expected to know prayers by heart. At 7, he started Latin lessons. Why Latin? Because it was the language of the church, of law, and of science. Knowledge of Latin separated the noble elite from the common people. Here's a fact. Many noble children had private tutors called preceptors. These teachers weren't just academics. They taught manners, discipline, and how to survive in a world ruled by etiquette. Sword training began young. A wooden sword was placed in the boy's hand almost as soon as he could walk steadily. By adolescence, fencing was part of daily life. A nobleman who couldn't fight was considered incomplete. Horse riding was another key skill. A noble boy learned to ride not for fun, but for war. Horses were symbols of power and status. A skilled rider was admired, respected, even feared. But it wasn't all glory. Childhood in noble families came with strictness and pressure. Every mistake was noticed, every action judged. He was told, "You are not just yourself. You are the family. You are the name." Here's another fact. Noble children were often sent away to other households to be trained. It was called fostering. Living in another lord's castle taught loyalty, discipline, and gave them valuable connections for the future. Daily routine was strict. Wake up at dawn. Morning prayers. Lessons in reading, writing, Latin, and sometimes Greek. Then physical training. Fencing, riding, hunting. Meals were formal even for children. Servants brought food, but the boy had to eat with grace. Never too fast, never too sloppy. Religion was central. A priest or chaplain often guided the boy's spiritual life. Confession, catechism, mass. Faith was not optional, it was duty. And yet, there were advantages. A noble boy had food, safety, and education that peasants could only dream of. He wore fine clothes, slept in a bed with curtains, and was surrounded by music, books, and art. But there were disadvantages too. He had no freedom to choose his path. If his family wanted him in the army, he became a soldier. If they wanted him in politics, he became a courtier. His life was written before he could even read. So, was noble childhood a blessing? Yes and no. It was a life of silk and privilege, but also a life of chains, invisible yet unbreakable. This childhood was only the beginning. After years of study and training, a noble boy was expected to become a man of status. His youth would bring him to the battlefield, the court, or the king's palace. Childhood was preparation. Adulthood was the real test. By the time a noble boy reached his teenage years, his path was already chosen. In the 17th century, noblemen were not free to do what they wanted. Their future was tied to two worlds, the court and the battlefield. Asterisk. At 16 or 17, a noble youth was no longer considered a child. He was expected to act like a man, to represent his family's honor. This meant discipline, courage, and the willingness to sacrifice comfort for reputation. For many nobles, the first step into adulthood was military service. Serving in the army was not just a career, it was an obligation. A nobleman who refused to fight was seen as weak, even dishonorable. Here's a fact. In France under Louis XIV, nobles often served as officers rather than common soldiers. Their birth gave them command, but their skill determined their survival. Battlefields of the 17th century were brutal, pikes, muskets, cavalry charges. It was glory or death, and sometimes both at the same time. Hunting was more than a sport. It was military training disguised as leisure. Chasing deer on horseback, handling weapons, commanding dogs. All of it prepared young nobles for war. But war was not the only path. Some noblemen were sent to the royal court, where politics mattered more than swords. The most famous court was at Versailles, built by King Louis XIV. It was not just a palace. It was a stage, and every noble was both actor and audience. Life at Versailles looked glamorous. Golden halls, endless banquets, dances, music, and theater. But it was also a prison made of marble and etiquette. Every gesture was watched. Every word was judged. If a nobleman bowed too late or spoke out of turn, his reputation could be destroyed. Here's a fact. Nobles at Versailles were required to follow hundreds of rules of etiquette. Even something as simple as how to hand the king his shirt was considered a great honor. Louis XIV used this system to keep the nobility busy with appearances while he held real power. A young nobleman who wanted influence had to master this game. He needed charm, patience, and endless resources for clothing, gifts, and bribes. Some succeeded and became favorites of the king. Others went broke trying to keep up. Education continued, but in new forms. Now it was diplomacy, philosophy, and literature. A nobleman was expected to quote Latin poets, play an instrument, and write elegant letters. Culture was as important as courage. But pressure was everywhere. At court, a careless word could make enemies. On the battlefield, hesitation could mean death. A nobleman's life was never relaxed. It was always a performance, whether in armor or in silk. Here's another fact. Duels were technically illegal in France, but they still happened. Nobles fought over insults, family honor, or even romantic rivalries. Many young men lost their lives not in war, but in personal duels. So what were the advantages of noble adulthood? Power, respect, opportunities to rise in rank, to gain land, to be seen by the king. A nobleman had chances that peasants could never dream of. And the disadvantages? Constant risk, financial ruin from life at court, death on the battlefield, loss of reputation from a single mistake. So was it worth it? For many nobles, yes, because in the 17th century, being close to the king meant everything. Honor was life itself. From youth to adulthood, the nobleman carried the weight of expectation. But there was still one more chapter to face. Family, legacy, and the challenges of holding power over time. By now, our nobleman has survived childhood training and the dangerous test of youth. He has dueled, fought, bowed, and smiled in places where mistakes were deadly. Now he steps into the next stage of his life. Family, legacy, and the long game of power. Marriage for a nobleman in the 17th century was never a matter of love. It was strategy. Families arranged unions to secure land, titles, or alliances. A wedding was a contract between houses, sealed with rings, signatures, and sometimes secret negotiations. Here's a fact. Many noble marriages were agreed upon when the bride and groom were still children. By the time they came of age, their future was already set in ink. Life as a husband brought both privilege and responsibility. A nobleman controlled estates, collected rents from peasants, and was expected to protect his lands in times of war. His wife often managed the household, but decisions about money, politics, and heirs fell to him. Children were not just children, they were investments in the family's future. Sons had to be trained as he once was. Fencing, riding, Latin, etiquette. Daughters were prepared for marriage alliances, sometimes as young as 12 or 13. But the golden halls of nobility had shadows. Wealth was fragile. Maintaining status at court was ruinously expensive. Fine clothing, endless banquets, gifts to the king. These costs could destroy fortunes. Here's another fact. During the reign of Louis XIV, many noble families went bankrupt trying to keep up appearances at Versailles. Some sold land, others borrowed endlessly. A few lost everything, reduced from power to shame. Political intrigue never ended. A nobleman might be respected 1 year and disgraced the next. A whisper of treason, a failed alliance, or even the king's boredom could end a career built over decades. Old age, if reached, brought reflection. A nobleman who survived war, duels, and debt carried scars both seen and unseen. Some grew bitter, others wise. A lucky few enjoyed comfort, reading books, hosting salons, and watching their heirs take their place. But even in his final years, a nobleman's life was never fully his own. His legacy, his reputation, and his family name mattered more than his personal desires. So what were the real advantages of noble life? Education, influence, access to power and history itself. And the disadvantages? Pressure, debt, danger, and the constant fear of losing everything. So, was the life of a nobleman blessed? Yes. He lived surrounded by silk, gold, and opportunity, but also cursed, for his chains were not made of iron, but of duty. And now, to see the full picture of the 17th century, we must step out of the palace. Leave behind the chandeliers and velvet, and walk into the wooden huts, muddy roads, and small chapels of rural France. Step outside the palace. Forget the chandeliers, the silk, the endless banquets. Now we are in the muddy lanes of a village, where life begins not with privilege, but with survival. For a peasant boy in 17th century France, childhood was short, very short. From the moment he could walk, he was expected to help. Tending chickens, gathering firewood, carrying water from the well, work was not a punishment. It was life. Unlike noble children who had tutors and fencing masters, peasant boys learned from family and community. Fathers taught farming. Mothers taught prayers, chores, and how to stretch food when there was barely enough. Education came not from books, but from the land. Here's a fact. Literacy among peasants in 17th century France was extremely low. In some regions, fewer than 1 in 10 could read. The church became their school. Boys memorized prayers, hymns, and the catechism long before they learned their letters. Religion shaped everything. The village church was the center of life, not just on Sundays but every day. Baptisms, marriages, and funerals all took place under its roof. The priest was often the only man in the village who could read and write. Meals were simple and repetitive. Bread, porridge, soup, sometimes cheese or beans. Meat was rare, reserved for feasts. Here's another fact. In many French villages, peasants ate more bread than anything else. It made up more than half of their diet. Childhood joys were small but real. Boys played with sticks, stones, and homemade toys. They raced in the fields, wrestled, and told stories by the fire. But these moments were short. By 7 or 8, many boys already worked full days alongside their parents. Clothing was plain. Wool in winter, linen in summer, often patched and reused. Shoes were precious and sometimes shared among siblings. A noble boy wore lace and silk. A peasant boy wore whatever his family could make or mend. And yet, there was a strange equality in hardship. Peasant boys grew up tough, resilient, and deeply connected to the rhythms of nature. They knew when to sow and when to harvest. They could tell the weather by the sky, the soil by the touch, the season by the sound of birds. Here's a fact. Child mortality was high. Nearly 1 in 3 children did not survive past the age of 5. Illness, poor diet, and accidents made survival itself a victory. But faith gave comfort. A boy might fall asleep to the sound of his mother whispering prayers. He might wake to the bells of the village church. Faith was not a choice. It was the thread holding life together. The contrast with noble childhood was enormous. The noble boy learned Latin and rode horses. The peasant boy learned prayers and plowed fields. One prepared for duels and court intrigues. The other prepared for hunger and hard winters. So what were the advantages of being born a peasant? Strange as it sounds, there were some. A peasant boy had freedom the noble child never knew. No endless rules of etiquette. No courtly performance. His life was harsh, but in some ways it was his own. But survival was never guaranteed. The peasant boy who lived through childhood faced the next stage. Youth, labor, and the heavy weight of supporting a family. Childhood was short. Adulthood came fast. By the time a peasant boy reached his teenage years, he was no longer considered a child. He was a worker, and soon he was expected to be a husband, a father, and a provider. In 17th century France, a peasant youth's life was defined by labor. From sunrise to sunset, he worked the land. Plowing, sowing, harvesting, the rhythm of his life was tied to the seasons. Spring meant planting. Summer meant endless days in the fields. Autumn was harvest, and winter was survival. Here's a fact. Peasants in 17th century France worked an average of 250 to 280 days a year. Not with machines. Not with horses in many cases, but with their own hands and simple tools. Food was both the goal and the struggle. A single bad harvest could ruin a village. Famine was not rare. It was part of life. In the 1690s, France suffered terrible harvest failures. Tens of thousands died of hunger. A young peasant man lived with that fear every year. Marriage often came early. By the late teens or early 20s, a man was expected to take a wife. But weddings were not luxurious affairs. They were practical agreements between families, sealed in church with blessings and modest feasts. Here's another fact. Peasant couples often needed permission from their lord or priest to marry. It wasn't simply romance, it was part of the social order. Children followed quickly, but fatherhood was heavy with risk. Infant mortality was high. A man could lose half his children before they grew up. And yet, families kept growing because children were also workers, helping with fields and chores. Clothing remained plain. A young peasant man wore wool or linen trousers, rough shirts, and heavy wooden shoes called sabots. Unlike nobles, he had no wardrobe of silk or lace. Every piece of clothing was worn, patched, and sometimes inherited from older relatives. Taxes were another burden. Peasants paid rent to landlords, tithes to the church, and royal taxes to the crown. Here's a fact. One of the most hated taxes was the taille, a direct tax on commoners. Nobles were exempt, so the poorest carried the heaviest load. War was an ever-present shadow. The 17th century was full of conflicts, the 30 Years' War, the wars of Louis XIV. Young men were often conscripted, dragged from fields to battlefields. Some never returned. Those who did often carried scars, both visible and hidden. But life wasn't only hardship. There were festivals, saints' days, and village fairs. Music, dancing, and storytelling gave moments of joy. The church bells that marked labor also rang for celebration. Faith remained central. Prayers before meals, blessings before harvest, processions through the fields. Religion gave structure to every stage of life. A young man believed that his labor, his suffering, and his faith were all part of God's plan. So what were the advantages of youth as a peasant? Strength, resilience, and a sense of belonging to a community that worked together. And the disadvantages? Exhaustion, hunger, taxes, and the constant fear of famine or war. So was the life of a peasant youth easy? Never. But it was real. Every day was a fight for survival, a test of faith, and a hope for tomorrow. From youth to adulthood, a Christian man's world was narrow but heavy with responsibility. And as he aged, he carried more than just tools and taxes. He carried a family, a village, and the weight of survival itself. The young peasant has become a man. He has worked the fields, married, and raised children. Now his life enters its final stage. Family, faith, and the slow weight of old age. Marriage for a Christian peasant was both blessing and burden. It gave companionship, children, and the hope of stability. But it also meant endless responsibility. A husband had to feed his family through good harvests and bad ones. And when harvests failed, hunger entered every home. Here's a fact. In 17th century France, families were large. It was not uncommon for peasant couples to have 6, 8, or even 10 children. But survival was uncertain. Half of them might die before adulthood, taken by fever, plague, or malnutrition. Children who lived became workers. They carried water, tended animals, and helped in the fields. A man's pride was not only in having children, but in seeing them grow strong enough to carry on his labor. But beyond family stood the church. Faith was the true center of life. Every Sunday, bells called the entire village together. Mass was not just worship. It was community, gossip, judgment, and hope all under one roof. Here's another fact. Peasants in France were required to pay a tithe to the church, usually 1/10 of their harvest. Even in times of famine, this duty could not be escaped. For some, it felt like a heavy injustice. For others, it was simply God's will. As a man aged, his role shifted. The heavy plowing and sowing fell to his sons. He took on lighter work, repairing tools, guarding livestock, passing down knowledge. Old men became storytellers, teaching children through tales of past winters, past wars, and past miracles. Clothing in old age was no different from youth. Simple, patched, often worn thin. But what mattered most was not fabric, but dignity. An elder commanded respect, even if his hands were rough and his back was bent. Here's a fact. Average life expectancy for peasants was low, around 40 years. But that number hides a truth. If a man survived childhood and war, he could live into his 60s or even 70s. Those who reached such age were rare and often honored as village elders. Religion grew stronger with age. Confession, prayer, and preparation for death became central. A man knew his life was short and eternity was long. Faith promised that his suffering had meaning and that heaven would reward what earth had denied. So what were the advantages of peasant old age? Wisdom, respect, and the chance to see children and grandchildren carry on. And the disadvantages? Weakness, illness, hunger and harsh winters, and the knowledge that one's family could still fall to famine or war. So was the life of a Christian peasant man easy? Never. But it was resilient, it was humble, and it was the foundation on which kingdoms stood. Because while nobles fought wars and played games of power, it was peasants who fed the nation. It was their sweat, their prayers, and their sacrifice that made the world of the 17th century turn. From silk halls to muddy fields, from duels to harvests, the story of men in the 17th century shows us one truth, that privilege and hardship are two sides of the same coin, and history was built by both.